Welcome to the EFMD Doctoral Community Webinar on doctoral ecosystems. What do we mean by that? The EFMD Doctoral Community is a relatively young but vibrant community that brings together business school professionals that are in charge of doctoral programs. The highlight of the community is our EFMD Doctoral Programme Conference, which will take place on 18 to 20 May in Brussels, hosted by Fleric Business School. And the conference theme of that conference is towards healthy doctoral ecosystems. So in order to already give you an introduction to this theme and to give you a little bit of a teaser to the conference, and also to give access to people that maybe will not be able to attend and still want to know and get to know our doctoral program community, we organized this webinar, and I have to say thank you to John Alexis Spitz for coming up with this brilliant idea and for organizing all of it and implementing it. Our conference will be chaired by two representatives of our host at Fleric Business School, and that's on the one hand Brecht Cardoen, the director of the DBA programs, and Eva Koels, the DBA and research manager at Fleric Business School. So they will be guiding us through the 3 conference days in May, but they will also guiding us through this webinar. And with that, I am happy to pass the word and the baton to Brecht.
Thank you very much, Friedemann, for your kind introduction of the webinar that we're having here today, but also of the conference already. And I do hope everyone is hearing me quite well as I'm speaking here. So my name is Brecht Cardoen. I'm the DBA director of the doctoral program that we have at Fleric Business School regarding the DBA, but also I'm co-chairing, of course, the webinar today, but also the conference, as you introduced that, with Eva. And Eva, perhaps you can also say hello.
Hello, welcome all to this session. I'm also co-chairing the conference and this webinar. I'm Eva Koels, and I'm managing the Research Dean's Office of Fleric Business School, which means all related to research and also the doctoral program. So nice to meet you all.
Voilà. And thank you for finding some time here today on this introductory webinar towards healthy doctoral ecosystems, because that's the topic not only of the webinar today, but also of the conference that we will have. Now, the outline of the hour that we'll spend today is as follows. Of course, a short word setting the scene and clarifying the topic a little bit. I think this is important. But after that, we have a nice keynote speaker. So Professor Arnoud De Meyer, already thank you for freeing up some time in your busy calendar to take us on that journey of ecosystems in business, but what does it mean for the doctoral setting? And that will be our main discussion point today. And at the end of the webinar, we'll also free some time to introduce the conference a little bit more in depth to you, but also to hear if there are any further questions. And regarding some Zoom etiquette, it would be nice if you indeed could mute your microphone. We would welcome any question through the chat box. I'm also happy to share then that questions with, for instance, Arnoud during his keynote speech. And yeah, let's make this a very informal and very fun moment here to be together. Eva, I give the word to you to have a few words about our conference.
Yeah, thank you. So indeed, like also Friedemann and Brecht said, this is an introduction webinar to the bigger conference that we have in May at our campus in Brussels. And maybe to give you some context about why we did choose this theme. Last year at the conference, it seemed like networking and networks are very important for doctoral research, and also very clear that the context makes each doctoral program very specific, and not only institutional context, but also the regional and national context you're in influences how you organize your doctoral education. And that's why we thought, okay, ecosystems, there's not one ecosystem probably, so let's zoom in on what this means for doctoral education, and also what is a healthy doctoral ecosystem. So that's the theme of the conference. And what we aim to do during the conference is that we provide you with details about what are then the necessary components to make such an ecosystem work, and also which connections are needed between those parts to make it a viable ecosystem. And during the conference, you can expect many different examples of different schools about how they organize their doctoral education, so that you can really get inspiration about what can I use from this example in our context, would that fit our context or not? And also, what are then the boundary conditions, like the relation between the supervisor and supervisee, well-being, all those points will also be touched upon during the conference, so that you can really go home with inspiration for your own programs. And as always, during the EFMD conference, there's of course a lot of opportunity to network, to interact, to bring your own examples, and share your own practices with the other participants. But we can go in more depth at the end of the webinar about the details of the program, but that's what you can expect at the conference. Now I'll gladly give the word back to Brecht to introduce the speaker.
Okay, thank you, Eva. And so together with the EFMD office, we have been thinking on who could make a valuable contribution in setting the scene on the topic of ecosystems, and it was not too hard for us to come to you, Professor Arnoud De Meyer, and to invite you for sharing your expertise here together today on the topic of ecosystems. Let me briefly introduce you to our audience. And I guess many of us already know you from one activity or another. You're emeritus professor at Singapore Management Universities, but of course, you also have been taking many other important duties at, for instance, Judge Business School or at INSEAD. During your very rich and long-lasting career of, if not mistaken, over 35 years of academic contributions. But here today, of course, also linking your expertise on innovation management, R&D in that setting of ecosystems. And in your presentation, if not mistaken, you will start from the business perspective on what are ecosystems, and that we have a good understanding on what it is and what it is not, as it might often also be, I think, misunderstood with other kind of collaborative organizational forms that we see. Not only what is the ecosystem, but also how do we manage that? So here's the title of your presentation: Managing the Doctoral Ecosystems, regarding leadership, but also in the end, making that spill over towards doctoral research. What does it mean in setting up ecosystems for doctoral institutions on the institutional level, so on the programs, but also on the individual level, as a person, as a researcher, but potentially also as a supervisor. So thank you so much for being here from such a distance. And that's then the advantage, of course, of having an online meeting here together. The floor is yours, and we're very, very interested in your presentation.
Thank you very much, Brecht and Eva and Vriendeman. Let me first start by sharing my screen with my slides. Give me 1 second to do that. I hope you see my slides. Is that fine? Yep.
Yes.
I thank you for the very kind introduction, Brecht. I should add to that that I'm actually an alumnus from the Vlerick School, or at least from its predecessor, right? From what existed in the 80s when the Vlerick School was created. As you pointed out, Brecht, I have 2 or 3 sort of goals in the coming half an hour, and will then be very happy to answer any questions you may have, and that you can share in the chat room. But first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and about, and you see here the front page of the book that I wrote together with a colleague of mine, Peter Williamson, which is now published about 2 years ago. And where we looked at the ecosystem edge, how can ecosystems help you in the face of disruption and help you to innovate. And since doctoral research is actually always about innovation, there must be something in ecosystems also for you as doctoral students or doctoral supervisors that are attending this seminar. Let me talk a little bit about the research itself. You see here on this list a number of companies that we have been studying. Some of you may know that actually the biggest part of Amazon is not the retail side currently, or the most profitable part of Amazon is not the retail side, but are the web services. Web services which were created by Amazon in 2006 when they sort of cleaned up their own IT systems, and when somebody had the idea of, hey, perhaps others will be interested in the web services that we can offer, the cloud services that we can offer, and all the services that come around. And Amazon has for cloud hosting a 32% market share worldwide in Q1 of 2021. In other words, a year ago, but it hasn't changed too much since then. More than Google and Microsoft together, who are the number 2 and the number 3. And we sort of wondered how Amazon was able to build fairly quickly. I'm talking about 2006, and by the time we were writing our book and looked at the case study, it was probably 2016, 2017. How were they able to build up so quickly a market share and offer so many services? And the answer was they did it with partners. They did it in a loosely coupled network of partners, where they provide the basic infrastructure and perhaps some of the basic software that is needed, but where they create a market space. And I'm sure that many of you do research on market spaces, but where they created a market space where many, more than 10,000 providers of services could compete with each other, could link to the infrastructure of Amazon Web Services and provide services to potential customers. We saw the same at the other side of the world with Alibaba in China and its financial arm and financials, but also with Tencent, the big competitor, I will say, or competitive ecosystem of Alibaba in China. We looked at a company like Rolls-Royce that was building up its manufacturing site in Singapore and needed to create a loosely coupled network of providers of skills. In other words, of universities and polytechnics and institutes of technical education that could provide the people, the skilled workers and the skilled engineers that would work in this manufacturing site, being one of the first, if not the first manufacturing site in Asia of aeroplane engines. And we looked at many different companies. Dassault Systèmes, which is a provider of product lifecycle management systems in France, Haier in China, being the biggest white goods producer in the world, etc. And we sort of always try to understand how they were able to either scale up very quickly, or how they were able to innovate very quickly, or how they were able to go into different sectors and cope with uncertainty. I'm not going to go to all of these examples, but I'm going to focus on one particular, and that is ARM. And I'm sure that most of you know this company, the company that provides the design of RISC processors, which go into your mobile phone. So all of you, whether you have heard of ARM or not, are customers of the design of ARM, because ARM still has an absolutely massive position in design of RISC processors. At some moment in time, they had 98% of the world's market in RISC processors, produced instruction set controllers. And they were all designed by ARM. But I will come back to that question, to that example immediately. But I just want to leave you with a question more. That is, when we look at all these successful companies, can we learn something from these successful companies about how we organize business schools, or also about how we will develop new systems for electrical vehicles, for perhaps I say hydrogen power transport, or how will we cope with rising sea levels? And my argument is we can never do it alone. We can only solve these big, hairy problems, or we can only do this very fast scaling up when we are like organizations that work in these loosely coupled networks with many partners, rather than trying to work in a tightly controlled supply chain. Now, I will actually spend a minute or two on ARM and the connected community across the semiconductor industry value chain. And I take this example because ARM was not, when we wrote the case studies, was not a very big company. It was at the moment that we started the case study and the research around ARM was in 2008. And then it was a company of about 2,000 people, not small, but not very big, in particularly not when you look at who are the other players in this value chain. And you see here in front of you a value chain of that risk processor business, that semiconductor business, in which ARM plays this very, very dominant role. Now you see that ARM itself is actually only an intellectual property provider, but works then with people who do the chip design, with people who do the foundries, who do the chip manufacturing, where you have behemoths, huge companies like Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company or Samsung. Then you have the chip sales and distributors, the equipment design and testing, where again you have big companies like ASML. Of course, then you have the original equipment manufacturers like Samsung, Huawei, Xiaomi, Apple, of course, Sony and others. And finally, you have the software partners that work with these OEMs. And you sort of think about, or you question, why can a small company or a small medium-sized company like ARM influence basically everybody else in this value chain when it comes to the use of reduced instruction set controllers and the processors that go, 5 or 6 processors that will go into your mobile phone. I have an iPhone here, but whatever you have, Samsung, Huawei, Sony, Xiaomi, or whatever, they all use the same design. And it is because this small and not so important player had a very good design that helps everybody in this value chain. They can work together, the OEMs can work together, although they compete vigorously with each other when it comes to the smartphones itself. They can work with each other around these risk processors, or at least the design of these risk processors, because for them, it's an essential component, but not a differentiating component of what they do. Everybody wants to have the best risk processor. And as a consequence, ARM, that started as a small company with 13 engineers and a capital of about £3 million in 1990, by 2000 had achieved a dominant position in this particular business, partially by bringing together everybody in this value chain and by learning from each other. And there's one anecdote that I wanted to tell you, that is that when they started with their design for risk processors, they went, for obvious reasons, to companies that were making chips like Texas Instruments. And they were trying to understand from Texas Instruments what they needed to do, how they needed to improve their design. But TI couldn't help them, but brought them into context with one of these, at that moment, big OEMs, Nokia. You may remember, some of you, although I guess some of you are too young to do so, but that at some moment in time, Nokia was a dominant player in mobile phones. And it was Nokia, which was, as you can see in this value chain, 3, 4, or 5 steps removed from ARM, but it was Nokia that could help them understand what really the questions were, what really the challenges were with risk processors. And that's where ARM learned that you have to learn from everybody in your value chain. You have to try to have relationships with everybody in the value chain so that you can learn from each other. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be a key element in the rest of what I'm saying here. That is, ecosystems, these loosely coupled networks that you see here, are actually designed, or should be designed, to learn from each other. I have here a different way of presenting it, where you see that ARM works with OEMs, system integrators, service partners, silicon partners, etc., etc. But on purpose, what I showed here is that they have relationships with these different partners. But with some of these partners, training partners, for example, there are several steps removed from them. They only learn from them perhaps through the software partners or the silicon partners. And this is not, and I draw your attention to that here, this is not a hub and spoke network. This is not something where ARM is in the middle and has contacts with everybody. This is a sort of amorphous network that works together with each other. And I come back to it, it's a loosely coupled network where you can ask yourself, like ARM, what are the type of partners I need to work with? What are the potential contributions they can make to me? But at the same time, and it's an equally important question, what's in it for them? What's the value proposition for the potential partner to join me in my network, to work together with me? For example, if I take the OEMs, they can bring their knowledge about what the future product roadmap is for smartphones, but at the same time, there is a very powerful user value proposition that is about creating the most stable and the most advanced design of what an essential component is of a smartphone: RISC processors, reduced instruction set controllers, so that you have less battery consumption or less power consumption because you have less instructions in your software. The companies, and I could give you many more examples, because before we wrote the book, we had, of course, a very extensive set of case studies. But I don't have the time. And I actually should tell you to read our book. But the conclusion we draw, Peter and I, from looking at all these case studies, that these organizations were successful, and they're all successful organizations. If I go to Dassault Systèmes, for example, as a software company, their market capitalization went from 5 billion euros to about 58 billion euros in 14 years between 2005 and 2019. These were successful organizations, partially, and of course there are other reasons why they are successful, but partially because they innovated through what we then later called business ecosystems. Our statement in the book is that when confronted with a high degree of uncertainty, something that many doctoral students are confronted with, business ecosystems may well be the best form of our organization to innovate and create new value and improve in efficiency in value delivery. Now, of course, when we started looking at our first case studies in 2008, 2009, 2010, we did our desk research, we did our literature search, and while the concept of ecosystems wasn't that often described, we did find actually quite a lot of work that could sort of lead to ecosystems. And let me first look at what economists did. I guess that all of you will know what I'm going to say in the next few seconds. That is that there is a lot of work by economists about why is it that in some cases we work in markets, and why is it that in some cases we work in hierarchies or in firms. As a management scholar, I use the word organization and firm. In the economics literature, you find more that concept of hierarchies. And we all know that the people who got a Nobel Prize for this, I will refer to them immediately, but Ronald Coase and Oliver Williamson basically look at many aspects of the differentiation between markets and hierarchies. But the two that I will highlight here is that markets have the big advantage that you have an easy coordination mechanism that is called the price, and that helps in reallocating production and social activities through that coordination mechanism. The big disadvantage of markets are, as we all know, the transaction costs, the fact that we have to write contracts, etc., etc. coordination mechanism in hierarchies is authority. The boss tells you what to do. But the disadvantage is that it is a system that is much more difficult, or has a lot more difficulties in adjusting itself to new circumstances. So in other words, the adjustment of production and social reallocation is much slower in a hierarchy. And as I said, people have gotten a Nobel Prize for it. Ronald Coase got the Nobel Prize for why is it that that firms are like centrally planned economies, and the answer he wrote is marketing costs, or what we call today transaction costs. Oliver Williamson looked very much at sort of the differences between markets at hierarchy, and he came to a theory why some economic transactions take place within firms and other similar transactions take place between the firms, and that is in the marketplace. But it's interesting that in the same year that Oliver Williamson got the Nobel Prize, Elinor Ostrom also was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics, precisely by saying there is actually something else than markets and hierarchies. There are these, the commons, as she called it, or how local property can be successfully managed by local commons without any regulation by central authorities or privatization. And that's what I, as a management scholar, look at. That is, in between markets and hierarchies, in between markets and firms, we see that there are a number of hybrids in terms of organization. And one of those hybrids is obviously the commons that Elinor Ostrom described, but also the business ecosystems that we as management scholars propose. And I will mention here, although usually I do that at the end of my discussion, that coordination mechanism in these hybrids, in these communities, is very often trust. Do we trust each other? Do we trust each other in that value chain that I described for ARM? Do I trust AWS, Amazon Web Services, in providing cloud services, etc.? Cloud hosting, sorry. The disadvantage of hybrids and communities is that trust can break down, and then these hybrid forms usually are not very sustainable, while markets are rather sustainable, and also hierarchies are very sustainable. So they are less stable forms of organization. We also looked at the management literature, and interesting enough, and it's always a good lesson to learn, that is that Jim Moore wrote already in 1993 about a special form of communities, ecosystems for innovation. And that is, he said, a business ecosystem is a network of organizations and individuals that co-evolve their capabilities and roles and align their investments so as to create additional value and or improve efficiency. Very few people paid actually attention in 1993 to what Jim Moore wrote. So you can sometimes be too early with a good idea. But in his definition, there are 3 points that I want to highlight. That is, first, it's about additional value creating. It's about realization that you can create the value by collaborating with others, and that you could not create that value by doing it alone. It's a network of organizations and individuals. And these organizations and individuals will co-evolve their capabilities and roles and align their investments. Value creation, networks, co-alignment of your capabilities, and sometimes your investments. There's of course a lot of more literature about that, and I'm willing to make my slides available later on, but I'm sure you can do your own research on that. But for us, Peter and I, in the book, when we say what are the benefits of an ecosystem, and we are very much aware it doesn't always has advantages. Sometimes a very efficient supply chain is much better than a business ecosystem. But when you want to take leadership in innovation, when you want to learn from partners, joint learning, when you want to operate very flexibly, when you want to scale up very quickly, think about a company like Alibaba that went from, or Amazon Web Services, that went from 0 to being a huge behemoth, an enormous company in 10, 15 years. If you want to scale up and if you want to cope with uncertainty, these business ecosystems, and hopefully then also your doctoral ecosystem, is much more efficient to work. And in the book, we say organizations exist in a context and operate in one or multiple ecosystems. Eva already said that. There are probably multiple ecosystems. And sometimes you do that without knowing it. The challenge for you in your doctoral ecosystem is how you optimize the use of these ecosystems to innovate and create and deliver value in the face of the VUCA world in which we are operating. So in the book, we discuss this, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but we actually think about how do you take leadership? How do you kickstart, perhaps as a smaller company or a doctoral student, how do you develop your ecosystem? And the first point is that you have to actually make sure that you are trustworthy. Trust is the coordinating mechanism. In other words, you're not going to take advantage of others. You need to demonstrate as an organization that you really believe in this working together in loosely coupled networks. And we describe quite a few examples of companies that are pretending they work in an ecosystem, but in fact want to control everybody else in that ecosystem. And then you lose the trust of people. You probably need to work with customers and companies, perhaps in your case, that tell you what the real problems are they're working on. If you want to work in an ecosystem, the ecosystem needs to have some kind of a roadmap where you're moving towards. ARM, the company that I referred to earlier, does this by bringing everybody together in Cambridge every year, probably before the COVID pandemic. But they brought everybody together in Cambridge with a lot of wining and dining, all the partners together to discuss what's the future of risk processors. You know, you may think that is very little that is more boring than that, but yes, they talked about where are we going to the next 3 years with risk processors. And everybody who goes home after that, not with detailed specifications, not with contracts, but with an idea of where we're going in this market, and thus having a roadmap for your investments, for your development, etc. And of course, you need to communicate the value of joining, shrink the entry barriers, and perhaps look for partners that can bring additional ecosystem to you. Now, we are realistic. Working in these loosely coupled networks is not easy, and you need probably to think about how you design the interfaces for improved productivity. You need probably to have portals that smoothen the path of data exchange. You need to develop a set of systems and organizational solutions to manage perhaps the exchange of complex know-how. Sometimes complex and tacit knowledge needs to be codified, but you also need to have mechanisms that help build trust. Help build trust between partners. And by the way, let's not be naive. Sometimes you will have people in your ecosystem that want to take an easy ride with you, that want to rip you off. You also need to have mechanisms for good governance and penalization of bad behavior. It was always about stimulating learning and innovation in the ecosystems. And not going into the details, if you look at my 4th bullet point, it's, I mean, the other ones are about encouraging learning, etc. But it's also gradually when you work in an ecosystem, you're going to build up what I would call public goods or private goods, but ecosystem goods, goods that belong to the ecosystem, that can be to the benefit of the whole ecosystem without disadvantaging the individual participants. And of course, as a researcher, you always have to find that right balance between sharing knowledge within the ecosystem to help it innovate, but perhaps also to think about what's my proprietary knowledge that underpins for a company my own future and my own profitability. And a third point, a 4th point actually, 6 steps to kickstarting development of ecosystem. thinking about interfaces, APIs, whatever you want to have to ensure that you can interact very well with each other. You want to stimulate the learning and innovation, and you also will have to understand, and this applies more to companies or to business schools than to individuals, that you need to have some different key skills that are required by the head of an ecosystem. You need to make sure that you can listen to your immediate partners, but also to very weak signals that come from elsewhere in the world. You must be able to nudge the ecosystem in the right direction. Use your very limited soft power that comes from your credibility, your vision, perhaps, the respect that you can that you have, the evidence that bolsters your own position with your partners, and you need to make sure that you're willing to collaborate with a community of peers. For companies, we say you need to lead beyond your own organization, build consensus, and ensure that a wide group of peers take ownership of most of the decisions you will make. But I would point out that third point here: be an active networker. Become yourself a trusted source of knowledge and information that others in the ecosystem may not yet have spotted, and make sure that you keep in mind why you developed an ecosystem. Now, till now, I've basically talked about our research on companies, as we have then translated in the book and a few papers that we've published. I actually wanted you to reflect after this sort of more general introduction about what does this mean for you as a doctoral researcher. And first of all, I would say schools in which you operate, most of them operate, not most of them, all of them operate in ecosystems. They are not, of course, business ecosystems, but think about it. Schools work with other schools, other research organizations, sometimes in a contractual organization, sometimes you just work together with each other, as many researchers will do. You work with companies who recruit perhaps some of the graduates of the business school, or who come with interesting problems to do research, or who bring in knowledge in the programs that you organize. You may work with governments that want to understand perhaps some new answers to problems in society, etc. Schools, universities always work in an ecosystem. Within that larger ecosystem that you may want to try to exploit, you as a doctoral researcher can benefit from that too. And the first point I want to make is, it is still an emerging field for research with, in my opinion, great opportunities. And not only for example, it's not only about how do I lead an ecosystem, but it's also perhaps, if I'm part of an ecosystem as a doctoral researcher, how do I make sure that I get the biggest advantages out of that ecosystem? And that's a very interesting research topic from my perspective, that is not only for the leader of an ecosystem, also in the business world, but for a participant in an ecosystem. How do you get the most out of it? We believe, Peter and I, that the future is about competition between ecosystems rather than between companies. We are writing a case study about Alibaba versus Tencent. These are two companies in China, but they are two huge ecosystems that are competing with each other, not exactly always directly competing with each other, but it's the ecosystems that compete rather than the companies itself. Is there a life cycle for a business ecosystem? In other words, will it peter out? Will it die out? Will it evolve into a very efficient supply chain? Probably yes, as we have seen in some cases. Are there preferred architectures for business ecosystems? And how can ecosystems actually, these loosely coupled networks, be the solution into the problems that you study in operations, marketing, product development, finance, etc. And then next, I would argue, you as a doctoral researcher, you always work in an ecosystem. And let's face it, you're often a not so influential participant in the larger network of researchers. Your thesis supervisor probably has more power. The school in which you operate has many other power relationships, and you may not be the most influential participant, but you still can steer that ecosystem in which that is relevant to you in the direction that you like it to go. Think about ARM, a small company that is actually able to steer a humongous value chain. Because you want to innovate and scale up quickly, and you need to rely on others with complementary capabilities. So my point that I would leave you with in my next slide, I will explain a little bit, is please analyze your ecosystem and understand how it can benefit you in your research. So how you do that, I give you 6 points to reflect on. First, analyze and draw your ecosystem. And like in that example that I gave for ARM, don't put yourself in the middle of a hub and spoke system. You're probably a small cog in a large network. Understand that, but understand what the ecosystem is in which you operate. Secondly, are there people you would like to invite into your ecosystem? Because they have capabilities, they have knowledge that is actually relevant to you. But what do you have to offer them? And how can you make it easy for them to join? How can you lower the transaction costs and how you can have the access to your ecosystem? Can some of them bring along additional ecosystems, additional contacts with companies, etc.? How do you build up trust and simplify communication and interfaces? How do you become trustworthy in that ecosystem? Optimize your learning. What will be something that will be an ecosystem good and what remains your intellectual property? And finally, how do you project yourself as a trustworthy networker and a dilemma manager? This is just an introduction. What I wanted to do with you is to reflect on what do we know about ecosystems? And secondly, what does that mean for you as a doctoral researcher? Perhaps there's a lot more to be done, but frankly speaking, this is where I have to stop sharing and open up to any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you very much,
Brecht,
Arnoud,
I'm looking at you now. Yes.
Yeah, you can do that. You can do that. So in the meantime, we've been following up on the chat box and still a warm invitation for some questions. Also, there were some discussions in the chat box ongoing on making the link between business and the doctoral setting, which was not always very clear at the start, but towards the progression of the talk, I think this became more and more apparent. And then there was that link to the DBA program, where a DBA program might or might not be seen as an excellent opportunity for building such an ecosystem, as it also links perhaps more closely to companies, to managers, to other stakeholders, which are not that usual suspects in the doctoral ecosystem, but also towards society. Not sure if you also see it that way, or...
It's an excellent question, Brecht. At SNU, we both have a traditional PhD program, and we have we have a DBA program. The DBA program is, by definition, much more of a expeditionary type of program, where people come together, take classes together, and then actually interact a lot with each other around their research. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen in a PhD program. It happens there too. But in a DBA program, what I have observed is indeed you get that sort of informal network, that loosely coupled network that I have been referring to a few times, of companies, of course, first of all, of individuals that work together with each other around the classes, around the lessons they have to take, etc., etc., but also that informal network of the companies that very often are behind these individuals, or the smaller ecosystems that are behind these individuals. And what I've often seen is that you then get, well, the DBA, the thesis that has to be written, obviously very often remains an individual exercise, or I would say always remains an individual exercise, that you start seeing the links between the different DBA topics, the different DBA efforts, the different investments that people make, and where they start learning from each other. And I mean, it is very much like that ARM example that I've tried to give, where a smaller unit actually can at some moment in time try to start moving the whole of the value chain in which you are operating. But even for a not traditional PhD program, where you very often, after you've taken the courses in the first year or the first 2 years, where it becomes very often an interaction between a doctoral promoter or a thesis advisor and the individual student. Even there, you very often work in international networks of, yeah, the thesis supervisor works with her or his colleagues elsewhere in the world, but you become very often a sort of an element of a larger network of doctoral researchers and perhaps postdocs that work on similar topics. And we shouldn't see ourselves as an isolated electron or an isolated molecule that works on its own. We actually should see ourselves always as researchers in this loosely coupled international and national network of researchers. And that's where I say, draw that. Go from an unconscious, I meet my good friends at conferences, to a conscious, actually these good friends and co-researchers are part of a loosely coupled network or a doctoral ecosystem. Make that move from that unconscious, I enjoy meeting my friends, to a very conscious, how can I steer this group of people in a direction that helps me? And it's not, it's very pragmatic that I mean that. It's not sort of that you try to exploit them in a sense. It's much more in a sense of, we're all going to benefit if we actually consciously realize we work in that ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. Linking this explanation also a little bit to that ecosystems, you mentioned that trust is very important in setting up an ecosystem, but there might be other barriers or pitfalls in making the things work. And David, for instance, give that example. I noticed that in the DPAs, if there is less of a publication requirement, that there is more collaboration. It might be easier also to set up ecosystems. Or another question from Arthur was then, yeah, like any value chain, a global value chain or an ecosystem that is global, there might be other pitfalls like distance or geopolitics or any delays that might happen. So apart from trust, where do you see the barriers of ecosystems and especially doctoral ecosystems?
That's the reason why actually, if I would go back to the book, we discuss a lot more than what I discussed here. That's the reason why I chose the 4 sort of slides from my normal presentations. The first one is you really have to draw your ecosystem and make sure that you understand who else would be good in that ecosystem. If I translate that into my own doctoral experience or my own research experiences, when you go to a conference, you can go there to share your information, to meet up your friends that you met at a conference a quarter ago or a year ago or 6 months ago. But you can also analyze beforehand, what else do I need to know? What is the additional complementary capability, knowledge that I need? And where or with whom could I find that particular knowledge in that particular conference? In other words, go from that unconscious to a conscious management of that ecosystem. The second one is your interfaces. Make sure that when you have a good view of your ecosystem, that you actually understand very well what are the interfaces that I have to invest in. And there may be language barriers, but it may be also barriers in terms of the fact that you're in different disciplines. The word value in management means something totally different from value if you are in philosophy, and yet it's the same word. I give this an example because you need to think when you interact with your colleagues in a doctoral ecosystem, how do you make sure that the interfaces are as efficient as possible? And also never forget that it's about joint learning. There will be something that you learn with all the participants in the ecosystem, and something that you learn for yourself. And understanding the distinction between what you learn for yourself, what you learn as an ecosystem, is, in my opinion, one of the other challenges in managing interfaces. Now, coming back to the second part of your question about distance, etc. One of the things that I've observed is, and this is from my position here in Singapore rather than sitting in Europe, although, as you know, I'm sitting actually in Australia for the moment. But from my position in Singapore, I see clearly a decoupling of the in science and technology of the Chinese world driven, or the Chinese dominated world, and the US dominated world. And until recently, Europeans were sort of trying to be in the middle of the two. I'm not sure that that is a sustainable position in the long run, but I really see a decoupling of scientific and research networks. And I think we should fight that. We should go against it. We should try to preserve them. But it's not easy because we can't see our Chinese colleagues that easily for the moment because they are not able to travel. We are not able to go to China. So in other words, I mean, from my position here in Singapore, even if I wanted to work with them, it becomes more and more difficult because online discussions are not as easy as the face-to-face discussion. We have to take into account that these geographical barriers are rising, and that distance in itself cannot be overcome. Physical distance, geographical distance can be overcome, but cultural distances, distances in values, in my opinion, are more difficult to overcome. And yet, I think we need to invest in that.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think along the way, Arnoud, you also have been answering Naveen's question to some extent and giving some examples on, as an individual scholar, what can I now do in that ecosystem? It's not only on the institutional or the hierarchies, as you've been phrasing them, but it's also as a personal level and with your conscious, unconscious kind of move. I think that's a nice example of, for instance, in attending the conferences. Taking a look also at the clock, knowing that we're about to end in a few more minutes. Also taking a look at some other questions that have been mentioned in the chat. There was one question on the book, if it would be accessible in open access or whether that's not available. That was one of the questions.
It's not yet in open access. It is still is available as an ebook, and I've seen that there are quite a few second-hand copies available also in Amazon for very reasonable prices, but it's not yet in open access.
Okay, thank you. And then also, indeed, there has been a special issues on ecosystems in which you also have been appearing and making a contribution that we can definitely share with the community.
We did a special issue on ecosystems through EFMD, and that is of course freely available.
Okay, good. I think this is where I will end the Q&A, and let me, on behalf of Arnoud.
Can I say one sort of repeat one thing, that is, ecosystems are for organizations, but when you have carefully read my definition that I took from Jim Moore from 1993, it's a network of organizations and individuals. The individual should not be underestimated, and don't go away from this presentation of, oh yeah, ecosystems is for organizations. Individuals have a big role to play in these ecosystems, and I've seen quite a few examples where actually the people that were the real sort of catalyzer, to use a term from our from chemistry friends, but the real catalyzer of the ecosystems were people that were acting as individuals. So don't underestimate your individual role.
Thank you very much for stressing and emphasizing that, and totally in line, I think, also with Naveen's question. Thank you for the insights, Arnoud. I know our time is limited and we could keep on talking about the subject, and luckily, and that's also then the subject of our conference, where we will have some time to deepen that. Hopefully also where we can address some other questions that are now appearing in the chat as well. So Eva, I would give the floor to you to make some closing remarks and invitations about the conference, while I'm still putting up some slides then to share with the community. Thank you, Arnoud. But also thank you to all people here attending and for having these questions in the chat box. This is how we learn. Eva?
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep it brief, but I'm sure that Arnoud left you with a lot of puzzling about what does this now mean for me, working as either a doctoral researcher, supervisor, or within the doctoral program as an administrator. And that's exactly what we will tackle during the conference, because the translation exercise is what we will do together during the conference, thinking about, it might be helpful if you join the conference that you think indeed consciously about what is then our ecosystem, either as an individual, but also as an organization, and that you bring that with you, and that you can, during the sessions, also enrich this and get inspiration about implications of choices that you make. Important is that this is maybe a more theoretical or intellectual exercise today. During the conference, we also have sessions where you will have the opportunity to bring your own challenge and also ask explicit input from other colleagues of other business schools. So to quickly walk you through the program, we will start with the keynote where we will, as an example, present the ecosystem of the Vlerick Business School as we host the conference. And then afterwards, we have an icebreaker exercise where we will actually play an improvisation. And the idea there is that we think about our own roles as individuals in the ecosystem, and also which vulnerabilities do we have as individuals. So that's the first day. On the second day, we have a mixture of different panels and also world cafes. The first day, we start with different examples of very different doctoral programs to give you an idea of how the context will impact your ecosystem. So that's the morning. And we will also talk about implications for your programs. After the coffee break in the morning, we focus on the impact of digital. Because of course the world changed the last couple of years. So what brought digital components? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? We also talked in this webinar about distance, but maybe there are also other challenges and opportunities related to digital, where we will have a panel with a DBA or PhD student and also faculty and administrators. In the afternoon, we will have world cafes around trust and also well-being, where we will discuss a case and then also look at what does this imply, what are boundary conditions, like we heard today as well, that trust is so important in an ecosystem and for sure in doctoral ecosystems. We will also have a case study of IMEC, which is a Flanders company, but also internationally known for microchips, and they will talk about how they build up their academic and industrial ecosystem. And we will have a session on Bring Your Own Challenge, where you can ask all kinds of questions to peers in other business schools and organizations. And then on the final day, we zoom out again and look at what are then the challenges in these times and how do they impact the doctoral ecosystems. And at the closing keynote, we talk about how to build and also not only diverse, but also inclusive doctoral ecosystems. So that's a bit what you can expect throughout the conference in terms of the content sessions, and of course a lot of opportunities to network, to meet in person, which I think many people are longing for, to really have some human contacts, and also to visit Brussels, of course. And I think Jess already shared the link, so you can still enroll and register and also find all the details of the program online. Yeah. don't know whether there are still some closing questions before we end about the conference or about the topic.
So not our microchip or IMAX microchip, but you could also see it as a kind of system. You never know, huh? As an ecosystem where every piece of that chip has its part to play, to help each other, to help oneself, I understood, but not only from your own perspective. Are there any questions on the conference or practicalities on Brussels? Is there anything we could still help you with?
I have a question, Brecht. It's Guido Groesbeek here. Do the speakers have to register for the conference, or are they automatically registered?
I think it's best also to register, huh, Jazz?
Yes, Guido, you should have received the link, and I will send it again after this session for you to be sure to formally enroll.
So we have to do it ourselves, to register ourselves for the conference.
Yes, I will send you the direct link, and you will just have to confirm and indicate your details.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Guido. Other questions? If not, I would like to thank many people. First and foremost, our keynote speaker, Arnaud, thank you for freeing the time, being in Australia, being on the move all the time, but for sharing your insights, and also to give us some hints and to give us some inspiration on the different dimensions an ecosystem discussion can bring, and those dimensions, of course, that we then will explore in our conference. So thank you to you, all participants, because we had such a nice mix of speakers and people from the steering committee and participants of the conference, but potentially also people who did not yet join the conference. Well, a warm welcome to each other over there. But thank you for your time and contribution here as well in the discussion. And thank you to the organizing committee, EFMD Steerco, for thinking along and making the program. We truly appreciate, and we're looking forward to seeing each other in May in Brussels in person. Take care and see you all soon. Bye-bye.